Welcome to Nasdaq Trade Talks, where we meet with the top thought leaders and strategists in emerging technologies, digital assets, and regulatory landscape and capital markets. I'm your host, Jill Malandrino, and joining me on the desk at the Nasdaq market site is Juliann Edwards, Chief Development Officer of the Nuclear Company, Adam Stein, Director of the Nuclear Energy Innovation Program of the Breakthrough Institute, Patrick Maloney, Co-founder and Chair of the Nuclear Company and CEO of CIV, as well as Mark Nelson, Founder and Managing Director of the Radiant Energy Group. We're here to discuss how nuclear solutions can solve America's surging energy demand and certainly having a resurgence in the energy itself. Let's go around the horn briefly here. Juliann, we'll start with you. Give us some background in terms of your work at the Nuclear Company.
Absolutely. As Chief Development Officer, I'm really hyper-focused on building a consortium and truly trying to lean in and solve the problem of building and constructing and deploying fleet-scale nuclear. In addition to that, I also serve as a chair of U.S. Women in Nuclear, which represents 5,000 members across 36 states. So very happy to be here.
All right, and we're happy to have you here. Adam, tell us about the work at Breakthrough Institute.
The Breakthrough Institute focuses on technological solutions to environmental and societal problems. And in doing so, our research shows that nuclear energy is a critical component of solving America's and the world's energy needs. So we provide the research on every level of what it's going to take to deploy new nuclear in the U.S. and abroad.
Yeah, and Patrick, tell us about your work at the Nuclear Company as well as what you're doing over at CIV.
Absolutely. Well, just for context, CIV is an investment platform focused on mostly backing, but sometimes building hopefully a handful of what we think will be some of the most important companies, really at the intersection of energy and industry. And the Nuclear Company is actually the first company that really just directly aligned with our thesis of we have a period of inflecting growth in energy demand, and yet relatively fixed supply, and the need for companies like the Nuclear Company to help cross that chasm is probably one of the most important things we felt we could work on.
And Mark, the work you're doing at Radiant Energy Group.
Radiant Energy Group is an energy consultancy with a specialty practice in nuclear power. So we're seeing surging interest around the world for solving the tough questions and problems that come up when you try to deploy what was previously the most controversial energy source. And
we're going to get into that moment here. But Juliann, let's talk about that, the public perception of nuclear energy. How is that shift allowing it to have some of a renaissance here?
You know, the part of it's generational, right? I mean, we came back from the Oppenheimer movie and seeing what we did to create nuclear energy, and you can just see that over time, it's occurred that this next generation understands and has unlocked the value proposition of nuclear as a whole, both in its economic benefit, its clean energy, and national security ties. It's at this perfect intersection. And we're also seeing that the tech companies, like the deals with Microsoft and Amazon recently, like they are now recognizing that nuclear is a clean energy source, and it's going to be a part of their strategy going forward. So we're going to see a shift from NIMBYism, not in my backyard, to YIMBYism. Yes, please bring it to my backyard, just because of just much prosperity it brings.
Mark, let's talk about demographics here for a moment, because you're seeing support especially among young people. Do you think part of that is a function of, let's call it, there is no recency bias when we think, about nuclear energy and some of the negative effects that it's had on global society?
Absolutely. We are just now coming out of a world where key decisions were made by people who, as children, hid under desks as an attempt to feel better about impending Cold War and nuclear bombs. Those people are leaving positions of power and influence. New people are coming up who never did any nuclear bomb drills and have plenty to worry about in the world without that fear.
Yeah, I think it's so interesting how the demographics show that. Part of it too is, Patrick, it's because of demand, which Juliann had alluded to before. I feel like this conversation is really front and center because of how the tech companies have been a big player in driving this demand.
That's absolutely true. Tech has clearly signaled to the market that it needs clean, firm power, and it needs it as soon as possible. And it can't get that from just renewable resources or other clean energy resources. To meet the growing demand, we absolutely have to build out clean, firm energy. We expect that to meet growing demand by 2050, we're going to have to build at least 150 gigawatts of new nuclear energy in the US alone, and up to 500 gigawatts of nuclear energy in the US, which is a huge change from the current about 2 gigawatts in the recent past built at Vogtle.
Yeah. Did I just call you Patrick? I apologize for that. I'm glad that you picked up on that, but apologies there.
Yeah.
So Patrick, I want to ask you the same thing as well, because
please.
When you think about areas you want to invest or advise in, give us some context around how many nuclear plants are operational in the U.S., how much more we need, how much do they power?
Yeah, exactly. Well, listen, I think just to put it into market context, if you look over the last 20 years, we were in a period of relatively flat growth in demand and relatively low volatility. And now we find ourselves in a world where really just three big, massive megatrends have fundamentally shifted the demand side of the equation. Yet we have relatively fixed, and shallow supply. And those are really just AI and the voracious energy needs associated with powering the compute demand of this country and, of course, countries across the world. Then two, we've deglobalized the world's industries that are now reshoring and reindustrializing domestic cores. And then, of course, this decarbonization broadly as a global priority have now created a moment where we have inflecting growth in energy demand, and yet still, again, that relatively fixed supply. So everything in the intersection of that dislocation is getting significantly more valuable. And when we took a step back and looked at it, we said, well, listen, there's only one known energy source that actually can meet the needs of the time to be able to handle all three of these applications. And that was nuclear, except where most of the world was chasing going to go build a new technology, we just kind of fundamentally believed we had solved this problem 70 years ago. It was called scaled nuclear. And to your question, we currently have 94 operational gigawatt scale reactors here in this country. We are currently, but will not be for long, the world's leader in nuclear energy production. We are going to, it is not a question, lose that title to countries like China, who have already seen this coming, realize that the energy is the input to all of their production and growth and output, and have already kind of begun to build a massive base of fuel to effectively continue to fuel their economy. This is an issue of national security.
Oh, I was just going to say, Mark, are we getting bipartisan support here? I mean, this is an issue of national security. I mean, we need to be able to, for our systems to be able to operate, right?
We are absolutely getting bipartisan support. Now, each party has a different reason they tend to like nuclear. What I'm finding is that with so few things to agree about in Washington, those two separate reasons for liking nuclear are actually starting to merge together into one front between Democrats and Republicans who all disagree on almost everything except the need to add as much nuclear as we can.
Right. I mean, regardless of what your reasons are for it, Adam, you can't execute on it, whether it's a climate tech thing or a national security priority, without the energy. You're not going to be able to execute on those.
Absolutely. The energy is the fundamental need that you have before you do other things.
Right.
So we need to have the energy in place to execute on other things, which means it needs to come first, which means we need to start scaling up now before the wave of new demand, instead of having demand pull the market forward. Because especially if we do that first, we add too much load before we execute on clean energy, then you're keeping fossil fuels around almost indefinitely because they can't retire, because the demand is growing faster than you're building new energy.
Yeah.
And we find from a system cost point of view, in addition to national security, that if you have between 15 and 30% of firm energy, you reduce overall system costs. So if we're increasing demand by 3x, we're going to have to increase capacity of firm energy, like nuclear energy, in order to keep the cost of energy down.
Juliann, tell us about some of the challenges and opportunities that you're seeing when it comes to building coalitions, because you're going to need buy-in from communities, regulators, financial stakeholders. I mean, these are capital-intensive, massive physical projects.
Oh, absolutely. I spent most of my career just using relationships and networks to go power and change and create movements in a positive direction. And I'll tell you, when I got the call to join the nuclear company, I was ecstatic, because this is something that the industry has been desperately needing and wanting. They want folks that will bring together, an organization that will bring together the utilities that currently operate the 94 reactors that Patrick just mentioned, and have done so efficiently, operationally, to a high standard, as well as safely. You're going to have to bring in the regulators, right? The Nuclear Regulatory Commission, the public service commissions, if you're in a regulated environment, help explain the pathway and how that economic growth will actually start to bear fruit. And then obviously the trades, right? I mean, there's going to be a massive insurgence of labor that's going to be required. And for us to deliver on our goals of tripling nuclear, if we build 200 gigawatts of new nuclear in this country, it will yield 270,000 jobs just in trades, just to build and construct those units. And then 100,000 permanent jobs plus.
Right.
And these are head of
jobs too.
Head of household jobs,
Right.
Really good jobs.
Especially when you're thinking about reskilling the workforce. I mean, these are the types of skills that are going to take you into the fourth industrial revolution.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think what's so fantastic, again, just being in a demand-driven market today, is we actually haven't had to really convince too many people of the economic opportunities unlocked by bringing new nuclear to these communities. I mean, you go meet with any governor, look at Georgia as an example. Where have you seen most of the advanced manufacturing and engineering capacity move in the last decade? Georgia. And the reason being is because we saw Vogtle 3 and Vogtle 4 ultimately completed, and therefore the industries that need to consume that 24/7 firm resource can now be borrowed within those communities. And it's not just the industry, it's the teachers, and then the service providers, the doctors, the lawyers, all of the broader ecosystem that gets created around what is effectively the enabling technology of all civilization. We're talking about energy being the input to everything that we create. And I think people are coming to the realization now that this is the critical input to their continued growth and prosperity.
That's an interesting point that you bring up, because Mark, when you think about how the demographics are changing and younger people are getting on board, do we have the education infrastructure in place? There could perhaps be, generations of teachers that might not have had exposure to this. From the industry perspective, are these outreach initiatives being made?
Yes, but everybody is waiting on some other player to move first. If you're going to fill up our engineering departments with students, and not just nuclear, you only need a few nuclear engineers for the nuclear industry. There's so many other jobs. Even operator jobs don't require a college degree to have an incredibly well-paying job like Homer Simpson. Instead, people are waiting to see orders for reactors before a lot of other things fall into place. Nobody wants to repeat the late 70s, where a lot of our engineering professors who are senior now remembered having all their students have to quit the field of nuclear because of the slump after 3 Mile Island. And they had to go find other jobs. If they stayed in energy, they had to go into fossil fuel. So a lot of people are waiting on specifically the gun in the air, people on the start line, and then building. That is going to cause many other things to fall into place.
It's so interesting, Adam, from an academic perspective, how this is going to shape. And I know you have done, advanced work in this area. Tell us about that.
I've done significant research in both nuclear economics and emergency preparedness and regulation. I have a doctorate in it, actually. And it's a very challenging topic because there's many challenges that have built up over the decades. And each one of those challenges needs to be addressed separately for things to start to fall into place. And many of them are being addressed right now, but it's not one big thing that's standing in the way of nuclear. It's a bunch of little things that have built up over time. And once we clear some of those out and we get some firm orders for new plants, then the market will make investments down the supply chain. The academic departments will make investments in expanding their programs. The trades will make investments in making sure workers are trained in those specific nuclear-related skills that are very similar to normal, say, electrician or welder skills, but aren't very specific to the nuclear regulations. And that's when we will have everything in place to start moving forward quickly. Right now, we are building momentum, but we don't have all the orders in place to actually have launch, as it were, of the industry. So that's the next step. And that's a little bit different this year at Climate Week than we've seen in the past, where instead of just discussing that nuclear would be good or other solutions would be good as well, we have discussion on how to actually execute that.
Yeah, well, it comes back to what you were saying before, Juliann, about no more NIMBY. Now, it's YIMBY, but, it sounds funny, but when you see Homer Simpson, he's carrying that green rod or whatever. I'm sure there's a technical name for it. But that, or it's leaking and so forth. I'm sure you've had to address some of those concerns. How do you respond to that?
Oh, absolutely. Well, it starts with just listening to what people know, right? How informed are they? And starting from the baseline, start educating them on perhaps things that may have seen in culture and movies or documentaries, and kind of grounding them in facts and data that we've actually seen out of organizations like Breakthrough Institute. Those are so essential to having a conversation with somebody, because you don't want to be grounded in something that's not factual. Two, it's organizations like Women in Nuclear, American Nuclear Society, North American Young Generation in Nuclear. I mean, we have this probably pool of, 38, 40,000 individuals, young as 18 years old to, retirement age, going out into their communities and help demystifying some of the facts that they think are going to prevent a nuclear facility being built in their backyard, to now saying, I actually want this because I want to be around a community of people that just has a higher degree of professionalism and excellence. That's what I'm seeing every time I go to a nuclear community.
Patrick, it's so interesting because off camera you were explaining how your background's more poli-sci, sociological focused, and that's how you got into civ. And I'm glad Juliann brought up the point about conversation, because when you think about society today, there are numbers of echo chambers and platforms that people have to spread disinformation, or all of a sudden everyone becomes a nuclear expert, Monday morning quarterback. That's something the industry is going to have to contend with.
Yeah, well, I mean, listen, I think what I love about building companies in this space today is, historically over the last 20 years, we can spend a lot of time debating ideology. And the reality is we are now in a post-ideological world where these are just demand-driven markets, where ultimately it's not just, we don't have to appeal necessarily to anyone's conviction on things like climate or other things. We can just say, literally, if you're one of the largest hyperscalers in the world, one of the largest industrial off-takers in the world, and you do not secure the fuel source to your continued growth and prosperity, you're effectively degrowth. And so we're talking about demand and order books. I mean, I think what we're observing right now is I've never experienced a moment in my career where I have had so much demand for ultimately this moment and this technology that I think creates the conditions where we can move past ideology and focus purely on the outcomes. And not just outcomes that feel good, but ultimately have real returns associated with them. These are return opportunities for any investor. And to your point, I do think we're moving to a place where everyone realizes that this is the critical input to their continued growth in their communities.
There's somewhere between that where not just the hyperscalers, the loads that want the power, we see from a public engagement standpoint, we have communities that are asking for nuclear to come to their town, particularly places that are closing coal sites or other fossil fuel generations, because those towns are generally smaller, they're generally out in rural areas, and they don't have other opportunities to keep their town together. And most other energy sources are difficult to site. You have to site them where the resource is. Nuclear, you can put it wherever you have an interconnection and you have a water supply for cooling, if that design even needs water for cooling. And so that's almost ideal to repurpose coal sites that are being shut down and keep those communities together. So we have communities asking the utilities to bring nuclear to their town instead of utilities saying, would you be okay with this?
Yeah, which is interesting because we did some work on what it takes to get an electrical grid built. That's a 10, 12-year process because of permitting and you have multiple jurisdictions and the whole slew of challenges that represents. To bring a nuclear power plant online, is it the same amount of time, or how would, let's say we need 20 more reactors as an example, how long could that possibly take?
Well, we'll go with one reactor for, it generally takes about 2 years of pre-application engagement with the Nuclear Regulatory Commission, and then it takes about 2 years to get a construction permit to start building. In that time you can do basic groundwork, but you can't actually build the nuclear components, and then it takes 2 to 5 years, depending on the design, to actually build the plant.
Right, so relatively it's the same amount.
Interconnect, yeah.
Pretty much.
But I think investors and the public at large, Mark, understands that these are massive physical projects. It's not like you're switching on the light and the lights go on.
Yes, so here's the key thing. Although transmission is taking a long time and nuclear plants have taken a long time to build, the nuclear plants that we have were mostly built on sites where the transmission was sized for double or triple the number of nuclear units that eventually got constructed. Sometimes we even built 2 but never started up 1. That was what was happening in the 70s and 80s around the panic of utility bankruptcies and the anti-nuclear movement. So we have a moment where through, I don't know, bad fortune turning good, you don't have to build more or new transmission to these existing nuclear plants that already have all the conditions that Dr. Stein mentioned to put in the new units. So we can add much faster to existing sites as we prepare communities who ask for nuclear for the next 100 years of their community's life.
All right, we appreciate everyone's insight. Thanks for joining us on Trade Talks, and thanks for joining me from MarketSite. I'm Jill Malandrino, Global Markets Reporter at Nasdaq.